Good afternoon and welcome to the ALCTS webinar on floating collections, building your patrons' horizons. I'm Carrie Cassio and I'm a member of the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee. I'm also a branch manager at the St. Charles City County Library District in Missouri. Our presenter today is Dawn Peters, and she has been with the Buffalo and Erie County Public Library for 27 years. Currently, she's the library director for the Orchard Park Public Library. Previously, she managed the Support Services Department of the Buffalo and Erie County Public Library, which included the acquisitions, cataloging, and processing departments. She was also directly involved with the library system's migration to a new integrated library system. As we go through the webinar today, if you do have any questions for Dawn, please type them in the question box on your screen, and Dawn will answer them at the conclusion of the presentation. Also, please note that today's session will be recorded, and you will receive an email after the session with a link shortly after the webinar. You'll also get a request for filling out a survey, and a copy of Dawn's slides will also be available to you. There might be a slight delay now as I turn the presentation over to Dawn.
Hello everyone, welcome, and just bear with me for a moment while I get my screen ready. Okay, as the webinar is titled Floating Collections, Building on Your Patrons' Horizons, today I'm going to share with you my experiences with having floating collections in our library system. What we will be discussing today are the benefits of floating collections, expectations, cost comparatives, including shipping and staff investment and maintenance, shelving space, etc., effects on special collections, rebalancing structure, one size does not fit all, and the role of librarians at the local units. Just to give you a little bit of a background of what my system consists of and how floating collections work in my system, as many of your systems are obviously varied. Within the Buffalo and Erie County Public Library system, we have 37 units, including a central library, 8 city branches, 28 contracting libraries consisting of 22 separate boards of trustees. Things to consider before you begin. What exactly is a floating collection? Will a floating collection meet your user's needs? Do you want your entire collection to float? That's not necessarily, you don't have to float your entire collection. You can just take pieces of your collection, and I'll explain that in greater detail as we move along. Are other libraries within your system as receptive to floating collections? How does it work? Who decides what floats? How is it rebalanced? Need to provide documentation on how to create a floating collection? Is having a floating collection truly a cost-saving measure? Do you still want to charge a fee for requests? Should you float to all locations or a smaller group? Review weeding standards, and I have to point that out that that's very important in terms of considering floating collections, starting floating collections. It's important to weed. Develop procedures to establish overflow or loss. Develop procedures for the floating determiner process. And I guess one of the key components is making sure that your integrated library system can accommodate a floating collection process. How will your location codes and item types affect floating materials? And how do you exclude certain item types, or do you exclude? A lot of what I have to say throughout this presentation will be reiterated, and there's a reason for the reiteration is because these are the things that we have to keep in mind when you consider beginning a floating collection, and these are the things that we experienced in the Buffalo and Erie County Public Library system. There are more things to consider before you begin. It's important that you have a redistribution procedure in place before you begin a floating collection. This will prepare you for when a smaller location ends up with too much stock. Consider maintaining the ability to reserve books from other locations. Otherwise, you will run into patrons who are expecting the same book to be available again at their library, for example, a summer reading list title or a book club title. You want to be sure that you have copies to accommodate the patron's needs. Even more things to consider, and I apologize in advance, you'll hear me repeat things as I said. It is important to have weeding standards in place before you begin floating collections. This will hopefully prevent libraries claiming to receive items in worse condition than what they are accustomed to having on their shelves. And as you all know, it is important to maintain a weeding schedule for our collections to keep them in good condition for the patrons. And as I mentioned, perhaps a refresher workshop on weeding wouldn't be a bad idea before you begin a floating collection. There are many advantages to floating collections. Again, there is always a refreshed collection as it is always changing. And keep in mind that for floating collections, those materials reside at the locations that the patrons return the materials at. They may check the book out at Library A and then return it to Library B, and then that item resides on Library B shelf until, again, it is picked up and checked out and possibly returned to Library C, for example. Smaller locations have the potential to have their collections increase in size if patrons are returning the items there. It also helps the staff at those libraries identify that there may be a need for more in the way of their collection on particular subjects or genres. The items are also immediately available once they are checked back in. There's no need to send, in our case, in the Buffalo and Erie County Public Library system, patrons are allowed to return materials at the various libraries from, they're allowed to return materials that they borrowed from another library to a different library. And when that happens, we ship those items back to the central library where they're then sorted again to go back to their owning location. With the floating collection, those materials stay on those shelves at the library that they were returned at. Oftentimes, with the floating collection, there's less of a need for duplicate titles. And again, collections are patron-driven. They move where the patrons want them. More advantages, less handling of the items by staff. As I just mentioned, when a library book from Library A is returned to Library B then has to send that book to the central library where it's sorted and then redelivered back to Library A. So one of the advantages of floating collections is that there's less handling of those items, which obviously makes them readily available for the next person to borrow. And with that, that reduces the transportation cost as they do not need to go back and forth. There's less processing materials needed, no need for library-specific labels. I know many of us have, we're label happy where we'd like to slap labels on all of our materials for a variety of reasons. Well, in a floating collection, that's not necessarily, you don't necessarily need to slap all of our special labels on the floating materials because they'll be going to different locations and they may not use those same labels that you do at your location. It also provides an opportunities for libraries to see if there's a need for a particular collection at their location by way of what is being returned. If you find that you keep getting Westerns, for example, returned at your location, that might be an indication that you need to purchase more Western material for your library. I would suggest that you start with certain collections such as large print, which is what we did here at the Buffalo and Erie County Public Library. We started out with the large print collection for a number of reasons, particularly because at the time we started large print, floating the large print collection, libraries throughout the system could not necessarily afford a substantial size large print collection because of the cost of the materials. What we did prior to making the large print collections float, libraries would come down to the central library, excuse me, where the central library housed a very large collection of large print books and borrowed, say, 30 to 60 books from the central library's collection and housed them at their location for a short period of time. So we decided that large print would be a good format to start with the floating collection. This way, every library could house a collection of large print materials, and of course, they would recirculate among the libraries. And keep in mind, it's very important to know that with a floating collection, at any point, you can certainly send back materials that you need to remove from your shelf, whether it's due to space or you notice that the floating materials aren't circulating. So I would suggest starting out with large print. Audiobooks is a good format. Picture books, romance paperbacks, biographies, readers. And of course, that's a decision that has to be made within your system. You may hear throughout the program that one size does not fit all. A collection at one location may not be as popular as it is at another location. Start with a collection that would complement each location's collection. Notice how I said complement, not replace or add. For example, the Library A may have a small collection of audiobooks for a number of reasons, but they are receiving many returns from Library B, and therefore Library A's audiobook collection is growing in size as well as their circulation circulation statistics. Before you move on to the process of making a collection float, we have found in our system that step-by-step instructions followed with screenshots makes it very easy for staff or those involved in the process to understand. We find that screenshots of how items are set up to float within your integrated library system is most helpful. If staff have a better handle on what is involved in the process, it helps them to better understand how floating collections work. In the beginning of the process of establishing floating collections, it is important to implement the weeding process if it hasn't already taken place for your collections slated to float. You don't want to have material that are water damaged or haven't circulated in whatever your qualifiers are, 18 months, 2 years, maybe longer. It depends on each individual library. You don't want those things to float. So by rights, maybe those items should be weeded out of the collection. So it's important to weed the collection so you don't expend energy on items that would not otherwise circulate. Even though they're in a floating collection, they still may not circulate. There's always that potential, of course. As mentioned before, start with certain collections such as large print, audiobooks, picture books, romance, biographies, readers. You may decide something else in your collection would be better suited to float. You may not decide to float your special collections, for example, your local history collections perhaps. Many libraries have home improvement sections or career and college sections. You may choose not to float those collections. Certainly it's all a choice, and libraries, the staff at the local unit should have input on what they feel should float or not should not float. However, keep in mind floating a special collection may be good for another location that wants to see if that subject would work at their location. Something to keep in mind. Important points to remember. It is important to involve all staff in the process. It's also good to keep them abreast of the process, the timeline. Have facts to back up this process to help staff understand the significance and benefits of a floating collection. Stress that feedback is always welcome. You want staff to understand that if they have any concerns or issues, that feedback is important. You may find that you have your process in place, but staff have discovered that there may be another process that needs to be put in place to help streamline the process. Again, weed before you begin. Let staff know that reassessments and evaluations will occur. You can certainly try a floating collection, and you may decide, you know what, this isn't working, and you may go back to not having that particular collection float any longer. You can do that. And it helps to have strong believers in the process. I won't read verbatim the next two slides. I included these two slides to help you should you decide to do a floating collection. This is what we do for our audio material that we do float. This is our rebalancing algorithm. And as you can see between this slide and the next slide, it's very lengthy, but I left that there this way. It's spelled out and you have an idea of what's involved in terms of rebalancing the audiobook collection. I find here at the Orchard Park Public Library that audiobooks, that's one of our top 5 highest circulating formats, and the patrons have identified that the collection has increased in size, and yes, that did require us to move other collections, not aside, but into different areas of the building to accommodate the increase in the collection of the audio materials. And it has increased our circulation statistics under the audio material format, and the patrons love every minute of it. And it's important to have dialogue with your patrons. Ask them, do you like the collection? Do you like the titles in the collection? Do you feel that there's something else that could be added to the collection? That's very important, not with just audio materials, of course, but with all of your collection. Patron input is very, very important and key. Obviously, we're here for them. So it's important to have a rebalancing process in place for whichever part of your collection you decide to float, as to help those to not keep getting the same or not getting the bulk of the returns and the materials returned to a particular library. But it's also important to remind those libraries, if they find that they're getting a lot of materials returned at their location, that they can certainly move those materials onto another library, or if you have it where they have to send it to the central library to be rebalanced elsewhere, then they can do that as well. So very important to have a rebalancing process in place. Key reasons for floating collections. Libraries, again, will constantly have refreshed collections, which is a huge benefit for the patrons. Materials are available for immediate checkout, as they do not have to go through the redelivery process, therefore less in-transit time. It will help to identify actual supply and demand by what is returned to the locations. And notice how all of these reasons benefit the patrons. It's important to have advanced planning. Decisions need to be made. Float all or part of your collection. I know there are libraries out there that have their entire collection, all of their materials floating. That may or may not work for your situation. And again, you can have, it is important to note that you may have your large print materials floating, but you can also have some of your large print not float. They still can be interfiled among each other, but you can certainly have materials that don't float, that remain on your shelf. So there's a lot of variations that you can do. Material type, decide on what material type to start with. Location, decide whether you want to start at one location or more than one or all locations. In other words, in our case, we have 37 units. Maybe we only want to float large print at half of those units, and the other half don't have floating collections. Yes, the chances of them getting materials returned to their locations that don't have floating collections, that's fine. They can either keep them residing on their shelf or send them back. Also, with regard to advanced planning, you might want to test on a small scale first, possibly start. I keep going back to large print collection, as was the case with ours, because Many of our libraries had smaller large print, if any, large print collections, so we felt that that was a good place to start. Plan for statistic changes. Be prepared to identify the changes in your statistics. Monitor the change to determine whether or not the collection that you chose to float, if that was a good collection to start with. Floating collection concerns. What part of the collection should float first? Do we have enough shelf space? How will we maintain our knowledge of the collection? And that's a very important piece in developing a floating collection, because the onus is on library staff to keep abreast of the collection. The days of, depending on what you float and where you float, you may in the past have known all the titles or all the authors, whatever your specialty is, or had an idea of what materials you had in your collection. Well, now that particular collection floats, so you might stop and think, well, we did have, now I need to see if we do have. So it does put the onus on library staff to always monitor the collection more aggressively than in the past because it floats. Obviously, things will come in on a regular basis. Floating items will come in on a regular basis, so it gives the staff the challenge to maintain the knowledge of the collection. What does that mean in terms of workload, and how will the patrons respond? In terms of workload, it is a paradigm shift for the staff, but an easy one in my opinion. And certainly the patrons, this is all for the benefit of the patrons, and it is well received. I can share that with you from my experiences, as well as others that I've spoken with. Additional concerns: how do you build a floating collection? Collection development. Can we add non-floating items with floating items in the same collection? And I just mentioned moments ago that you can. Should our weeding policy be the same for floating collections? Absolutely. It depends. It depends how you do your weeding process and whether or not it would properly meet the weeding policy, meet the floating collections and the nature of the floating collections, and a paradigm shift for staff. And being that you always have to keep an eye on the collection, just so you're aware of what's in the collection, and then you have to monitor if you're getting a lot returned back at your location, that you have to then pull some of the materials and send them on back, either again at your central library or at your central point for redistribution, or send it on to another library, however you choose to do that. Advantages: it is definitely patron-centered. Again, it increases materials availability and provides continuously refreshed collections. Some variables in assessing success: statistics on total number of items that floated in 12 months. That could help determine the success rate of the floating collection, as well as statistics on total number of items that floated to a new location per month. That might help that library determine needs for their location that they may not have otherwise been aware of. Floating collections and collaborative collection development. Depending on where, when, and how you start a floating collection, there's the element of cooperative or collaborative collection development. Following are points to keep in mind when it comes to collaborative collection development and the impact that it has on floating collections. Now, depending on your collection development procedures at your locations, it may have an impact on your floating collection, or it may not. Benefits of collaborative collection development: extended scope of resources, floating collections, collection development experts, cost savings, and one-stop shop. Continued benefits: checklist of adult and juvenile materials for the system to select from and to add to their library's local collection. Materials ordered based on popularity and trends purchased for local libraries for their collection. Online tools we use to place our orders, and great customer service. Barriers of collaborative collections and experience, budgetary constraints, the long-standing budgetary constraints. It is in when you're building your local collection, obviously you keep in mind your patron, your library's patrons' needs and demands and wants and whatnot. When you're building your collection, it may be that at some point that particular collection will have been decided to float. So it's important to keep that in mind when you're building your collection. You may know that another library has a following for home improvement, and your patrons have a particular need for career materials or college materials because your library's near college facilities. These are things that you have to keep in mind when you're thinking of both building your collection as well as floating collections. Gaining support for collaborative collections. Open dialogue is key to any successful collaborative project, obviously. Getting input from all involved, including the patrons, is a win-win situation. Things to think about, have dialogue with your patrons. It's also important to know whether or not your ILS system can produce reports to identify weak areas or popular areas. For our system, we have reports run through our ILS system that we internally refer to them as Dusty reports. And based on the qualifiers that we use, for example, I tend to use 18 months. If items haven't circulated in 18 months, the report lists all those items, and then I go to that collection and determine if it's something that should have circulated with 18 months or not, and determine, and that helps to weed the collection, helps maintain the collection. Also, examples of cooperative collection development. Within our system, we have several checklists from which we work with. We have what we refer to as a rush list. These are items that are purchased at the central location for all of our libraries, and this is done on a weekly basis, and those tend to be the best sellers in a variety of formats, not just adult fiction and nonfiction. We have monthly checklists, which are a list of titles of recently published materials and or materials that were revised and republished that we may deem necessary for our collection, that we select from on a monthly basis and purchase for our locations. Then we have, of course, special checklists, for example, readers, picture books, more so replacement copies. And we use those to help build our collection as well. And then we have our Western New York Library Resources Council Resource Sharing Committee developed a purchase-on-demand pilot program, which also adds to our collection. And some of the resources that I have used that you may find helpful, floating collections is a time for your library to convert, and then a website, a link rather, that also has some great information for you. Okay. And I'd like to express to you that there are a lot of things to keep in mind when you do consider floating collections that you have to first weed. Weeding is very important before you begin a floating collection. You don't want to go through all the work of taking the collection and converting it into a floating collection and then handle material that hasn't moved in a long time. Or you may want to take that chance and be a part of your floating collection and find out that it will move. It depends. But you can incorporate floating materials and non-floating materials in the same collection. You can certainly do that. It's important to check with your ILS system to see if they can accommodate a floating collection. That's also a key point. I would recommend that you have a floating collection committee per se, involving staff from all the locations and getting their input on their concerns or their recommendations of things that should be floated or not float. I would also provide a timeline to the staff as to what the process is in terms of starting a floating collection, whether you're going to start with some libraries or all libraries, which collections you're going to start with, whether it's large print, picture books, even DVDs. It depends. Or you may decide, if you're building a new library, that you'll have that entire library's collection float. What's also important is that you have the redistribution process in place. So when the library A calls and says, what do? I have too many large print books coming to my library and I don't have the shelf space. You need to have a process in place where they can return those books, either if you have the process done at the central library, or if you have the process where they can just send it on to other libraries they deem would benefit from the overflow that they've received. It's important to get feedback throughout the process while you're creating the floating collection, once the floating collection takes place, and when it's been in place for some time. It's important to get the feedback so you can reassess or reevaluate whether it's the process or the collection or working with the ILS system. It's important that you keep track of your collection once it is a floating collection. That way you're able to have an idea of what's in your collection should you get asked the question from the patron, whether or not you have a particular item in your collection. It's important to get the staff involved in the process. It helps them to have a better understanding. I can tell you that within our system, and we started with the large print collection, it went over very seamlessly. It was well received. And of course the patrons, they don't know what's going on behind the scenes. All they see is an increase in the collection, which is more for them to choose from. And I can tell you that we've gotten favorable feedback both with the large print and our audiobook collection. We haven't moved much in the direction of trying another collection at this time in our system because we have a lot of we had a transition with our director, and then we have a budget crisis, as all of us are all too familiar with, unfortunately. So you don't have to necessarily, when you're planning on starting a floating collection, you don't necessarily have to start with your entire collection. It's good to have a timeline in place, so it'll help better plan for all the things that I discussed in the presentation, the things that you need to be aware of. And with that, I am ready to take any questions that anybody may have at this time. And hopefully I answered your questions on floating collections. It is a wonderful process. It does have favorable responses from both the patrons and the staff. And outside of the rebalancing structure, which is not difficult once you have a process in place, it really truly runs fairly seamlessly. And again, it refreshes your collection. It's immediate access for the patron. It's less in-transit time, less handling of the item, which is a cost saving, obviously, for your shipping department. And it adds to your collection. So with that, if anyone has questions, I'll be more than happy to answer them. If you think of them after the fact, by all means, you can certainly forward your questions, and I will answer them at a later time if need be. I hope that after listening to this presentation that you consider floating collections, because truly it is a benefit. In my opinion and in my experiences, it's a win-win situation for the patrons, and it does help build your collection. So with that, if there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer. Okay, I see a question. Is the rebalancing algorithm a kind of automation? If I understand your question correctly, is the rebalancing algorithm a kind of automation? In this regard, it's a little complicated because there's 37 units. It's not automated in the sense that the computer tells it for us. No, it is manually done. And it's a matter of identifying the qualifying points in the algorithm as to who gets what. And it is done within our catalog department where the items are returned in our situation. So it's identifying the different qualifiers that we have listed for the audio materials, and that determines, for example, if Orchard Park purchases 6 audio titles a month and they circulate X amount of times within a month, and 4 titles came back to be redistributed, because Orchard Park has a high success rate, then Orchard Park will get 3 of those titles, and the remaining title will go to another location. That's just a very brief overview of how that works. But it depends on the qualifiers, and it is done manually. So hopefully that'll answer your question. I have another question here. What ILS system, what ILS do you have? The Buffalo New York County Public Library has Circe Dynex, and it works very, it's wonderful for floating collections. We have no issue with that. I have another question. Can you estimate how much time staff spend on rebalancing the collection? Honestly, I would have to say not much. But that depends. Again, in terms of the large print collection that we have here, that's a very popular collection here at the Orchard Park Public Library. So we'll review it maybe at the end of the month and send back some of the materials, and only because of space restrictions. With regard to our audio material, audiobooks, both CD and cassette, the only time we'll send materials back is if we have a triplicate title. We tend, even if we have duplicate titles, they will circulate. A triplicate title we'll send back merely for spacing issues, and that doesn't happen that often. But again, it depends on what collection you decide to float, the popularity of that collection, meaning how often does it circulate. But here, it's not a whole lot of staff time, truly. I have another question. What level of staff do the rebalancing? Well, the pages will come and tell us that the shelves are too tight. So then a clerk will go and take a look at the titles and make sure that there aren't any. In our large print collection, we don't have enough space to have duplicate titles, so she'll pull the duplicate titles off. In the audio collection, she'll identify if we have a triplicate title, and she'll pull the triplicate title off and then send it back. She'll box the materials up and then send them back. The librarians keep abreast of the types of materials that are on our shelf, so we can answer certainly answer questions of the patrons on what do you have such and such on your shelf, or do you have such and such subject in your collection, and so on. I have another question. Can you estimate how much delivery services were reduced once floating was started? No, that unfortunately I cannot answer. And keep in mind, we have the two collections that are floating, both the large print and the audio materials. That's just two points of the collection. Now, among all 37 units having those floating collections, yes, there is a tremendous cost savings. However, keep in mind, if you do more than two formats, more than two material types of a floating collection, you'll see a greater cost savings. There's so many variables that are involved, and I, at this point, cannot tell you how much was reduced. I can just tell you that it was that it had some cost savings involved. Unfortunately, I can't give you the particulars on that. It's for me, at my level, it would be difficult to determine. If you want to pursue that, I can try and see if I can get that information. But right now, I'm afraid I can't answer that question. But that's a good one. Thank you. Okay, I have another question. Did you remove the location identifying labels from the items? Yes and no. Some libraries, and that can be a challenge, because you may have a library whose patrons are accustomed to color coding for whatever reason, or you may have a library where patrons are accustomed to having, for your audio collection, a spine label identifying the author, whether it's nonfiction or fiction. We have, because we started the audios within the past year, in the meantime, prior to that, we have libraries that have bright neon labels on the front of their audio materials with their library name on it. Did we remove those? No, it wasn't cost effective or efficient, prudent to remove those labels. And truthfully, it doesn't phase the patrons in any way, shape, or form. They don't see that Orchard Park has an Alma CD on our shelves. To them, they just are concerned with having John Grisham's audiobook in their hand to check out. So it hasn't, that I'm aware of, been an issue having the different labels on it. Any new items that are purchased do not have any labels outside of the general Buffalo and New York County Public Library label. So hopefully that helps. I have another question. Did you have to create a lot of new collection codes when you started floating? No. Well, the only creation was we had to put float-LP for floating large print. So staff knew that that was a floating item. So I guess that is adding a new code to help staff identify that it's a floating item. I have another question. Do you have an estimate of how much money your library has saved using the floating collection? I'm not sure what you're asking of how much money your library has saved using the floating collection. If it's with the transportation of materials going back and forth, where again in the Buffalo and Erie County Public Libraries process, when a patron returns an East Aurora book here at the Orchard Park Library, we have to send that book down to the Central Library, where it gets resorted and goes back to the East Aurora Library the following day. That's our current practice for non-floating collections. With floating collections, we don't have to go through that process. So, and with that, as I said earlier, that's not I don't have an answer for that. I could possibly see if I can narrow down a figure for that. I'm not directly involved in that regard, other than I can tell you that it has reduced perhaps the number of shipping boxes that go back to the central library. I can follow up on that if need be. I have another question. When an item stays at a branch, it was returned to, do you change the location and item type in your ILS for that item? No, you do not have to. That's the beauty of the floating collection. No, the item just goes right to your shelf where you would file that item. If a floating large print book was returned to your library, all you have to do is file it with your large print materials. So you do not have to change any code. You do not have to change any label. You do not have to do anything. You just simply file it on your shelf with the other large print materials, or whatever the floating item is. That's where you would shelve it. And that's a really nice feature. Very good question. Thank you. I have another question. How do you determine which agency gets the material initially? Did you order X number of copies and then decide where they go when they arrive, or do vendors drop ship the materials directly to the original owning agency? No, the vendors do not drop ship. Yes, there is a formula that we use here to determine how many copies a particular library gets, and there's I don't remember the exact formula, but it's based on population, size of collection, and circulation. There's a formula with which the Central Library uses to determine how many copies the Orchard Park Library will get of the latest Grisham book. Yes, none of that is drop shipped. That's for our regular process. That's not for floating items. We did not start a collection. Let me backtrack. The materials that we decided to float, we had already had in our collection. They just were converted. A report. That's a very good point. A report was run in our ILS system to convert the current material code, or rather item type, to reflect floating. So we did not have to physically pick up each and every item and mark it floating. The system was able to do that through a report run. So hopefully that'll answer your question. I have another question. If an item is labeled float in the catalog, does that mean you don't know exactly where it is? No, it does not mean that. You will see in the catalog that it will list which library it is residing at. Underneath the library, in our ILS system, it has the library, and then next to the barcode, or above the barcode, it'll have the library listed. So you will know where that item is, even though that it floats. Wherever it is currently residing, you will know which library it is at. Good question. Thank you. I have another question. Can you share that formula? I'm sorry. Is it the formula for the allocation of titles, or the formula for redistribution? Can you please repost that question? And the likelihood of me getting that formula is good. So if you could just repost that question and let me know if you mean the formula for redistribution or the formula for number of copies allocated to a unit. Okay, I have another question. Do your materials come cataloged and processed from the vendor, or is it all done in-house? No, we do not order our materials cataloged and processed from the vendor. We do that in-house. We have a catalog department, an acquisitions department, and a processing department that takes care of all of that for the system. The question, the formula you mentioned for the allocation of title. I will try and get that for you and follow through and give you that answer, okay? Thank you. All right. You're welcome. Okay, are there any more questions? Very good questions. And feel free to, if you have further questions after this presentation, I'm more than happy to help in any way that I can. Okay, it looks like there aren't any more questions. And with that, I'd like to say thank you for allowing me to share with you my experiences. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dawn, for all of your advice on planning and implementing floating collections. We kind of talked a little bit before. It's certainly a system that my library system has been considering. It's really been useful to hear more about it from the front lines. I kind of laughed at the pages were telling you when things are getting too tight, because that's usually when I know I have to weed something. It's when the pages come through and tells me they can't shelve anything. So nice to know that works for floating collections as well. I'd like to also thank all of our attendees today, and I hope that you found the session useful. Afterwards, you'll soon receive a short online evaluation form. Please take a few minutes to respond to the questions and return the form to us. Your questions are very valuable to us and help the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee plan all of our new continuing education offerings. Information about all the upcoming ALCTS webinars can be found on the ALCTS homepage, which is ala.org/ALCTS. On your screen, you see 9 more webinars that are on the calendar through the end of November, and we have more coming for the spring. If you have suggestions for webinars or other continuing education opportunities, they are welcome at any time. You can contact the ALCTS office or submit a proposal. We do have a form online on the website. There are additional education opportunities coming up. We do have some web courses and some e-forums. Right now, the e-forum on in-kind materials donations is going on, so if that's something you're interested in, you can get on our website and sign up for that as well. I'd like to thank Aping Chengathi for helping me provide some technical support for today's webinar. The support that she and our other colleagues make on our technical support subcommittee really make it possible for us to present these webinars smoothly. So thank you for joining us this afternoon, and we hope that you'll participate in other ALCTS offers for continuing education again in the future. And thank you again, Dawn, for